Annika Stalczynski. The first case is Annika Stalczynski, a Newark, Delaware honor student who walked into a wooded area behind an elementary school in October 2020 alongside a young woman she had known for years. Only one of them walked back out. What does it take for a 17-year-old to plan a killing as carefully as this one? And why has the motive never been spoken aloud? Annika Stalczynski was 17 years old. She was a senior at Newark Charter School in Newark, Delaware, and a classmate of Madison Sparrow. Delaware State Prosecutor A.J. Roop would later describe the relationship between the two young women in court. He said the two had a relationship going back over a number of years. Very little about Annika's family or earlier history has ever been released publicly. What is known is what happened on the afternoon of October 2nd, 2020. On that day, Annika and Madison's 19-year-old former boyfriend, Noah M. Sharp, had already made a plan. They reached out to Madison and offered to take her out for ice cream and to help her shop for a sister's birthday gift. Madison agreed. The three drove together to a wooded area behind McClary Elementary School in Newark. According to court documents, Sharp ambushed Madison there. He had brought an aluminum baseball bat with him. He used it to take her life. An autopsy later confirmed she had died of blunt force trauma to the head. Sharp would later admit in court records that the killing was premeditated and that he and Annika had carried it out in the afternoon, evening hours of October 2nd. Madison was reported missing that same night. The next day, the Delaware State Police issued a gold alert. Investigators went to Noah Sharp first. The interview was enough to lead detectives directly to the wooded area behind the school. On October 5th, they recovered the bat. They found blood droplets. They found Madison's clothes. And nearby, on that same morning, they found her body. Noah Sharp was arrested on October 6th, 2020. Annika Stalczynski was indicted by a New Castle County grand jury and arrested on November 17th. She was charged with murder first degree, possession of a deadly weapon during commission of a felony, and conspiracy first degree. She was held on more than $1 million in cash bail. Could a young woman who had just sat for senior portraits really have walked into a wood with a planned weapon? And yet the bat, the bleach lines, and the timing all said yes. On May 13th, 2022, Annika took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to murder first degree and conspiracy first degree. The terms required her to testify truthfully against Noah Sharp at his own trial. She did so in October 2022. Sharp was convicted on all counts. On February 3rd, 2023, Annika returned to court for her own sentencing. The Delaware Superior Court sentenced her to life at level 5. Because she had been a juvenile at the time of the offense, Delaware law gives her the right to apply for a sentence modification after 30 years. Delaware Attorney General Kathy Jennings publicly called what had happened in those woods nearly beyond comprehension, noting the depravity of what these two defendants, whom the victim believed were her friends, did to young Madison. No public psychological evaluation has ever been released. The motive that brought a senior to plan a killing with the ex-boyfriend of a classmate has never been officially explained. In late 2024, Annika filed a motion for post-conviction relief. On December 22nd, 2025, the Delaware Superior Court issued a written decision on that motion. She remains incarcerated in the Delaware Department of Correction Women's System as of today, where she will need to wait the full 30 years before any modification of her sentence can even be considered by a court. The Newark Charter School community founded the Madison Sparrow Memorial Scholarship and the annual Love Wins 5K to support future educators in Delaware. 2 vigils were held for Madison in October 2020, in the weeks after her body was found. Her grandfather, Tom Mason, addressed reporters after the killing. He said simply, "It was an act of violence. It's inconceivable." While one Delaware story closed with a senior in prison and a scholarship in her victim's name, the next would unfold in an Ohio kitchen with a 12-gauge shotgun and a daughter who was barely 16. Mindy Berenyi. The next case is Mindy Berenyi, a 16-year-old who picked up her father's shotgun on a September afternoon in 1995 and fired before he ever turned to look at her. For nearly 2 decades after, her name moved through Ohio appeal courts, and then one day, she walked out of a Marysville prison gate. How does a daughter end up there in the first place? And what happens to the kind of life sentence everyone thinks is permanent? Mindy Ann Berenyi was born on April 16, 1979. By 1995, she was a high school student in Antwerp, Ohio, in rural Paulding County. Her parents, William Andy Berenyi and Shirley Berenyi, had divorced years earlier. Her mother had left her 3 children with Andy, who remarried his second wife, Joni Berenyi, in 1992. Mindy lived in that household with her father, her stepmother, and her 2 younger brothers, Steve and Scott. The years leading up to that September were not steady ones for her. She had a documented history of running away, of substance use, and of a 9-day psychiatric hospitalization for depression and suicidal thoughts. She was also pregnant. On September 27, 1995, Mindy arrived home from school around 4:30 in the afternoon. She broke into her father's locked bedroom by pounding on the door until the lock dislodged. Inside, she removed his 12-gauge shotgun. She then went into a kitchen bathroom and waited. When Andy Berenyi came home a short time later, Mindy shot him in the back from approximately 40 feet away. He died at the scene. Her stepmother Joni came home a short while later to a situation she had never imagined finding. Mindy was now holding the shotgun to her own head. Joni talked her down before police arrived. When officers entered the home, Mindy confessed at the scene. What followed was almost a decade of legal back and forth that almost no one outside the courtroom truly understood. Paulding County Deputy Keith Baird filed a juvenile delinquency complaint the next day. After probable cause and amenability hearings, the juvenile court on May 20, 1996, transferred the case to adult court. The judge found she was not amenable to care or rehabilitation as a juvenile. She was indicted on aggravated murder with a firearm specification. On December 9, 1996, Mindy pleaded no contest to the lesser charge of murder. She was sentenced to 15 years to life. The case did not stay closed. In 1998, that conviction was overturned on appeal because she had not received a juvenile physical examination required by Ohio law. A second trial in June 1999 was declared a mistrial due to jury tampering. In October of that year, after a change of venue to Allen County in Lima, she was tried a 3rd time. The defense argued battered child syndrome under a then-recent Ohio case called State v. Nemeth. Defense psychiatrist Dr. Kathleen Quinn testified that Mindy showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. Her mother and a child welfare investigator named Laura Alvarado supported the defense. Her 2 brothers, both of her paternal grandparents, and her stepmother Joni testified that Andy had been strict but not abusive. Prosecutor Joseph Burkhardt argued Mindy had killed simply because she did not want to live by her father's rules. Mindy was convicted of aggravated murder with a firearm specification. She was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 20 years, plus a 3-year mandatory firearm specification. Her defense attorney, Larry DeLabio, fainted when the verdict was read. At the sentencing hearing, the family's grief surfaced in language that broke even the courtroom. Mindy's paternal grandfather, Bill Berenyi, Andy's father, addressed her directly. He said, "I'm sorry, Mindy, but that's what you deserved, and that's what you got." On January 23, 2013, after about 13 years inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Mindy Berenyi was released on parole. A 26 clemency request from 2006 had earlier been denied. She was placed on 5 years of supervision through the Adult Parole Authority in Columbus. She has since completed parole. The case was featured on the CBS 48 Hours episode Daddy's Little Girl in 1999. In her own quiet words since release, Mindy has said she has begun to forgive herself. While one Ohio teenager eventually walked back out into the world, another Ohio case from a decade later would never produce the courtroom drama anyone expected. Meredith Poling. The next case is Meredith Poling, a 15-year-old in Hardin County, Ohio, who in August 2006 fired a shotgun inside her own home and changed everything in her family's life forever. She would never spend a day inside an adult prison. So what does justice actually look like when a teenager kills a parent and the law decides she is still a child? Meredith Poling was 15 years old. She lived with her mother, Michelle Murnahan, in Hardin County in the northwestern part of Ohio. Limited public information has ever surfaced about her family or her earlier years. What is known is the date that ended Michelle's life and the 4 years of legal arguments that followed. On August 1st, 2006, inside their Hardin County home, Meredith shot her mother Michelle in the back of the head with a shotgun. Investigators said the two had argued shortly before the killing. From the moment officers responded, Meredith denied responsibility, and she continued to deny it throughout every proceeding that followed. The contradiction between her denial and the available evidence sat at the core of every legal step ahead. Could a teenager really maintain a single position long enough to outlast every prosecutor who came near her file? Meredith was placed in the Logan County Juvenile Detention Center in Bellefontaine, Ohio, beginning in 2007. From that detention center, the question of where her case would actually be tried became the long fight. Hardin County prosecutors wanted to try her as an adult. They believed the severity of the crime, the firearm used, and the apparent planning behind it warranted what Ohio law calls a bindover, meaning the transfer of her case from juvenile court to the general adult division. The juvenile court rejected the bindover, finding that the existing juvenile system was sufficient to handle her case. Prosecutors appealed. They believed the case was simply too serious to leave inside the juvenile system. But in February 2010, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to hear the prosecution's appeal. That was, effectively, the end of the road for any prospect of trying Meredith Poling as an adult. The state's options for prosecuting her as an adult had been exhausted. Later in 2010, Meredith Poling entered a negotiated plea in juvenile court. The terms of that plea, under the rules of Ohio's juvenile justice system, limited what the state could do with her. She would be held in state juvenile custody. She would receive education, services, and supervision while inside, and the maximum sentence the system could impose was custody until her 21st birthday, not a year longer. For some communities, including the one in which she had grown up, that was a difficult outcome to absorb. Logan County Sheriff's Lieutenant Greg Fitzpatrick spoke to reporters about the strangeness of the case from a law enforcement perspective. He said, "We've talked around here about how unusual it is, and how we kind of feel sorry for her." It was a comment that captured exactly how few people knew what to do with what they were watching unfold. A daughter had killed a mother. A juvenile court had limited her custody to a date on a calendar. Everyone simply waited. During her time in juvenile custody, Meredith Poling earned her high school diploma. She continued to deny her involvement in the killing throughout, and no later admission was ever made publicly. The Logan County Juvenile Detention Center was the only institutional setting she ever experienced. There would be no transfer to an adult women's prison. There would be no parole hearing. There would be no decade-long appeals process. The Ohio juvenile system had decided what her sentence would be. On her 21st birthday in 2011, Meredith Poling walked out of state juvenile custody and was released. She was no longer in any prison system. She was not on adult parole. She had no further criminal proceedings filed against her. By every public record available since, she has lived a private life. The polling case has since become a quietly referenced study in Ohio's juvenile bindover statute, often used in legal trainings and academic discussions of where the law draws the boundary between rehabilitation and incarceration. While one Ohio case closed with a young woman walking out on her 21st birthday, the next would carry the kind of weight that has redefined a state's juvenile justice debate for over 3 decades. Lori Tackett. The next case is Lori Tackett, a 17-year-old from Madison, Indiana, whose name became permanently tied to one of the most heavily reported killings of any female group of teenagers in U.S. history. After a 60-year sentence, she walked back out a free woman on the 26th anniversary of the night her life and the lives of 3 others changed forever. How did a case this serious end in parole? And what kind of household shaped the young woman behind it? Mary Lorene Tackett, known as Lori, was born on October 5, 1974, in Madison, Indiana. By 1992, she was 17 years old. Her mother was a fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian. Her father was a factory worker who had 2 felony convictions dating back to the 1960s. Lori would later say that she had been harmed during her own childhood on more than one occasion as a young child. In May 1989, after Lori's mother discovered she had changed from a dress into jeans at school, Mrs. Tackett attempted to strangle her, which brought child welfare authorities into their household. As Lori moved through her teenage years, she became increasingly rebellious and fascinated with the occult. Her mother once demanded that the father of Lori's friend, Hope Rippey, burn a Ouija board and perform a religious cleansing of the Rippey home. On the night of January 10th into January 11th, 1992, Lori drove 15-year-old Tony Lawrence and 15-year-old Hope Rippey from Madison to New Albany, Indiana. They picked up Lori's 16-year-old friend, Melinda Loveless. According to court records, Melinda had stated she wanted to confront a young girl named Shanda Scherer over a romantic rivalry. What followed was hours of harm spread across multiple locations in Jefferson County, ending on a rural road. Could the cycle of that night really have been stopped at any point by any one of the 4 young women involved? The case broke open quickly. Tony Lawrence, the youngest of the group, broke down at a state police post the same day the body was found. Her statement led to the arrest of all 4. All 4 were charged as adults. Lori Tackett was sentenced in January 1993 to 60 years for the killing, with a related Class B criminal confinement count. Inside the Rockville Correctional Facility, Lori served roughly half of that sentence with credit for good time. Journalist Aphrodite Jones, in her widely read book Cruel Sacrifice, portrayed Lori as among the most actively involved of the 4, despite Melinda Loveless having been the original instigator of the confrontation. Her interest in the occult and in self-harm, reported in detail by Jones and by trial coverage at the time, became extensively documented pieces of the public profile that built around her name. Investigators and journalists alike returned to those details when trying to make sense of how a teenager from Madison, Indiana, had ended up at the center of a case this serious. On January 11, 2018, exactly 26 years to the day after the killing, Lori Tackett was released on parole. The timing of her release was something her victim's family never publicly forgave. The conditions of her parole included offender treatment, no contact with children, and 2 years of supervised parole through the Indianapolis Parole District. She has since completed parole and is no longer in custody. She's not the only one to have walked back out. Tony Lawrence was released in 2000. Hope Rippey was released in 2006. Melinda Loveless, who had been the instigator of the original confrontation, was released on September 5, 2019 from the Indiana Women's Prison after serving roughly 23 years and 8 months. For Shanda's family, watching all 4 young women cycle out of Indiana custody over the years has been a renewal of the same wound each time. The killing reshaped Indiana's juvenile justice debate in ways that still echo today. Shanda's mother, Jacqueline Jacques Vaught, became a national public advocate against teen violence in the years after the killing, working until her own death to keep her daughter's name in the conversation. The case has been the subject of multiple books, repeated documentary segments, and an episode of Deadly Women. 4 young women had driven the same car that night. All 4 are now free. While one Indiana case closed with all 4 women eventually released, the next would unfold in a London courtroom around a single object pulled from a hairstyle. Rebecca Douglas. Rebecca Douglas, a 15-year-old in Battersea, South London, who in May 2011 took the metal handle of a comb out of another teenager's hair and used it as a weapon. The young woman she struck did not die that day. She died nearly 5 months later, after a coma her family was never able to bring her out of. How did an item designed for styling hair become the cause of a life sentence? And how much did social media play a role in pushing 2 young people toward that street corner? Rebecca Douglas was 15 years old at the time of the killing. According to her defense counsel, Jonathan Kinnear, she had a traumatic and violent childhood and had been sleeping rough at the homes of various friends. Her own life had been unstable long before the moment that would define every news cycle to come. In May 2011, in Battersea, Rebecca confronted 16-year-old Julie Sheriff on a South London street. The 2 young women had been exchanging messages on their mobile phones over what court records would later describe simply as malicious gossip involving boys. The argument escalated. According to evidence presented at the Old Bailey, Rebecca took hold of a pintail afro comb that was being worn in Julie's red weave hairstyle, removed it, and used the sharpened metal handle of the comb to strike Julie in the head. A witness later described the noise of the strike in raw terms. They told the court the sound was like the noise it makes when we kill a goat back home. Julie collapsed. She had suffered bleeding to the brain. She was rushed to hospital and slipped into a coma. For nearly 5 months, her family sat at her bedside, hoping she would wake up. She never did. Julie Sheriff died in hospital on September 21, 2011. The investigation against Rebecca came together quickly because of digital evidence she had created herself. Detectives recovered a BlackBerry message sent from her own phone. In it, she wrote, "I see some girl that I hate, like I actually hate her with a passion, and I kind of stabbed her." A separate voice recording captured her saying that she would go to the hospital and ensure Julie did not survive. Those words, recorded by her own hand, would later sit inside the prosecution's evidence bundle. The trial was held at the Old Bailey in July 2012. The jury convicted Rebecca of murder. Under United Kingdom law, she could not be named publicly during the trial because of her age. Her name was only released after she had turned 16. On August 28, 2012, Judge Nicholas Cook at the Old Bailey sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 10 years. From the bench, Judge Cook spoke directly to Rebecca about what she had done. He told her, "Your victim died a long, lingering death some months after you attacked her. You took possession of the pintail comb and struck out in fury." Her defense barrister, Jonathan Kinnear, argued that she had not meant to kill, only to hurt. The jury had found otherwise. And if you have made it this far and enjoy content like this, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Julie Sheriff's family had emigrated from Sierra Leone in 2006 so that her father, Raouf Sheriff, could work as a police officer in the United Kingdom. After the killing, he addressed reporters with words that have been quoted many times since. He said, "I am left to wonder why I brought her here, and if I hadn't, she would still be alive." He also spoke of the months his daughter had spent in a coma, telling the press, "The result of seeing my beautiful, bubbly, brilliant daughter bedridden and in a vegetative state has left me extremely depressed. Rebecca Douglas remains detained in His Majesty's Prison Service. With a 10-year minimum tariff handed down in 2012, she became technically eligible for parole board consideration in 2022. No public record of a successful release has ever been located. She remains in custody as of today. While one London case closed around a single comb and a hospital bedside vigil, the next would carry into a Michigan apartment on Christmas Day, with a courtroom that years later would tear its own verdict apart. Delilah Sherwood Evans. The next case is Delilah Sherwood Evans, a 17-year-old whose Christmas Day in 2016 ended with her mother dead inside their Clinton Township apartment, and Delilah walking out into the cold, wrapped in a blanket. A jury sent her to prison for life. And then, almost 3 years later, a Michigan appeals court took every piece of that verdict apart. How does a case that seemed this settled end up unraveled? And where is she now? Delilah Sherwood Evans was 17 years old. She lived at the Washington Place Apartments in Clinton Township, Macomb County, Michigan, with her mother, Sonia Riang, and her younger brother. Sonia was 45 years old and had used a wheelchair since a car accident left her unable to walk. Court records and defense statements would later describe a household pieced together against difficult circumstances. Delilah's defense attorney told the court that her father had 16 children across multiple households, and that she had been profoundly neglected. 2 weeks before Christmas Day 2016, Sonia had taken Delilah to a local hospital for psychiatric evaluation because, in her own words, Delilah was acting strangely. The hospital discharged Delilah after a brief assessment without her ever seeing a psychiatrist. On Christmas Day, December 25, 2016, inside the Washington Place apartment, Delilah picked up a kitchen knife. According to the Michigan Court of Appeals opinion, she used it on her mother roughly 124 times. She struck Sonia in the back and chest. She covered her with a pillow. She also stabbed her younger brother in the hand. Afterward, she cleaned the scene with bleach. She covered her mother's body with a blanket. Then she fled the apartment. A relative discovered Sonia's body. Could anyone really make sense of what had just happened, even from inside that household? The next day, December 26, 2016, a clerk at a 7-Eleven in Fraser, Michigan, recognized Delilah from a police photograph circulating that morning. She had walked into the store wrapped in a blanket, claiming she was homeless. Fraser police arrested her. Her custodial interview was unlike almost any that detectives had ever conducted. According to court records, Delilah told investigators her mother had been a witch named Helen, and her father was Satan. She said that during the killing, gnats had flown out of her mother's stomach. She told them she was 1,000 years old. At the Macomb County Jail, she was placed on suicide watch and prescribed antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication. The trial began before Judge Richard Coretti in early 2018. The defense raised an insanity defense. 2 defense experts, Dr. Megan Rowland from the Center for Forensic Psychiatry and Dr. Stephen Miller, diagnosed Delilah with schizoaffective disorder. On February 22, 2018, the jury rejected insanity and instead found her guilty but mentally ill of first-degree premeditated murder. On April 5, 2018, after a hearing under the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama, Judge Coretti imposed life without parole. From the bench, Coretti said, "To plot and then execute a diabolical plan to brutally murder your own mother is unspeakable. I can't imagine how you could plunge a knife 120 times into your mother who raised and nurtured you." For nearly 3 years, that verdict sat in place. Then came the appeal. On December 17, 2020, the Michigan Court of Appeals released a decision in People v. Evans that did something few people had expected. Judge Elizabeth Gleeker, writing for a panel that included Judges Swartzel and Beckering, vacated both the conviction and the life sentence and ordered a new trial. The panel found that prosecutorial misconduct had occurred during the cross-examination of defense expert Dr. Rowland. The opinion stated that the prosecutor had likened the doctor to a cartoon character, accused her of writing her report in crayon, baselessly accused her of withholding evidence, misrepresented her testimony, and badgered her relentlessly. The court also affirmed that Delilah's trial counsel had been ineffective during the Miller hearing. As of today, Delilah's post-remand status is not publicly clear. Most likely, she is housed at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti or back in Macomb County Jail. Her family was publicly divided in 2018. Half-sister Rosanna Evans defended her, saying her younger sister obviously had a mental illness and did not understand anything, while one Michigan case was sent back into the courts after years had passed. The next would unfold in a single Ohio park on a single September afternoon. Marissa Smith. The next case is Marissa Smith, a 17-year-old from Louisville, Ohio, who walked into a public park brawl on a September afternoon in 2022 carrying a knife she did not bring herself. By sundown, a 22-year-old man was on his way to a Cleveland hospital. By the time she was sentenced, she was facing 15 years to life. So what does it look like when a planned fight turns into a killing? Marissa Grace Smith was 17 years old, a resident of Louisville in Stark County, Ohio. Under Ohio law, 16 and 17-year-olds charged with murder are automatically bound over to adult court, meaning her case never had a chance of being heard in the juvenile system. Family Court Judge David Nist found probable cause on October 13, 2022, and her case was transferred. Marissa had no publicly disclosed prior criminal history. On September 13, 2022, at around 4 in the afternoon, multiple groups of teenagers had agreed to meet at Wildwood Park, located at 500 Sturzbach Avenue in Louisville, for a planned brawl. Among those who arrived was 22-year-old Michael Devin Morris Jr., a young man from nearby Alliance. According to multiple witnesses who later testified, Marissa took a knife from the waistband of her 15-year-old male co-defendant. She advanced on Morris while screaming at him. She struck him once in the chest. Morris was transported by emergency services to Cleveland Clinic Mercy Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. A civilian flagged down a Louisville officer who had been patrolling the park. The defense presented at trial would argue that Morris had pulled Marissa toward him and walked into the blade. The prosecution argued the act was deliberate. Could a planned fight really tip into a killing because of a single moment when nobody knew how to stop? Marissa was charged with murder, felonious assault, and aggravated criminal trespass. The 15-year-old co-defendant who had carried the knife was charged in juvenile court. A complicity to murder charge against him was dismissed. He pleaded true to felonious assault, aggravated criminal trespass, and carrying a concealed weapon. Family Court Judge Michelle Cordova later placed him at the Boys Town facility in Nebraska. Marissa's jury trial began on May 8, 2023, before Stark County Common Pleas Judge Natalie Haupt. The case was prosecuted by Assistant Prosecutors Margaret Scott and Richard Nicodemo. Stark County Public Defenders Aaron Phillips, Anthony Kaplanis, and Caitlin Shoemaker handled her defense. On May 12, 2023, the jury found her guilty of felony murder and felonious assault. On May 22, 2023, Judge Haupt sentenced Marissa to 15 years to life. That is the Ohio mandatory minimum for the offense. From the bench, Haupt addressed both Marissa and the public who had come to watch the proceedings. The judge said, "I'm sure there are a lot of regrets that Ms. Smith has. But those mistakes cost Michael Morris his life, and this court is required to impose a sentence of 15 years to life." Marissa did not speak at sentencing. Michael Morris Jr.'s family, however, did. His aunt, Tara Burns, turned to Marissa from the gallery and addressed her directly. She said, "You had a phone and you stabbed him in the chest. You chose to leave him to die." She spoke to a courtroom that had spent the previous days hearing only legal language. Tara's words cut through that. They reminded everyone present of the man who would never walk out of Cleveland Clinic Mercy Hospital. Marissa filed a direct appeal in the Ohio 5th District Court of Appeals. The appellate decision, State v. Smith, 2024 Ohio, 1557, was issued in April 2024. She is presumed housed at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, the state's main women's prison and female intake facility. Her sentence carries parole eligibility as early as 2037 or 2038, depending on the credits she earns inside. The dynamics of that September afternoon at Wildwood Park have continued to weigh on Stark County. The fact that the knife had not been in Marissa's hand when she arrived, but in the waistband of a 15-year-old standing beside her, raised questions that the trial alone did not resolve. For the family of Michael Morris, none of the legal language ever fully captured the simple fact that he had walked into a public park and not walked out. While one Ohio courtroom delivered a 15-year minimum sentence for a single moment in a public park, the next case would carry across the state of California, into a relationship triangle, and toward a planned killing in 2 separate acts. Catherine Bellflower. The next case is Catherine Katie Bellflower, a 17-year-old from Livermore, California, whose name became attached to a planned killing fueled by a relationship with an older man she wanted for herself. Her victim was a young woman who had just married him. And 5 months later, Katie was working on a second target. How did a single relationship in Northern California carry 2 young women to the edge of their lives? Catherine Bellflower was 17 years old. She was a young woman in the Livermore area who, by the accounts of those who knew her, had been described in the local press in striking ways. Dorothy Lum, the mother of one young woman Katie later targeted, initially described her as bright and energetic, an overbearing teenager type. She had a reputation in her area for being involved with older young men. And at the center of the events of late 2002 was one man in particular. His name was Michael Simons. He was the new husband of 16-year-old Jenna Nanetti. After their marriage, Michael moved in with Katie, and a sexual relationship began between Katie and Michael that ran in parallel to his marriage. The relationship became the engine of what came next. On October 6th, 2002, Katie, Michael, and a 19-year-old friend named Jeffrey Hamilton carried out what prosecutors would later describe as a planned killing of Jenna. The 3 drove together in Hamilton's Dodge Neon. According to court records, Katie struck Jenna from behind with a baseball bat. The wounded young woman was then driven to a remote location where Michael Simons shot her with a shotgun. The 3 burned Jenna's Mustang afterward in an attempt to destroy any forensic evidence. Prosecutors would later argue 2 motives. The first was that Katie wanted Michael for herself. The second was that Michael believed he was the beneficiary of Jenna's life insurance policy and that the proceeds could be used to buy a house. For months, the case sat unsolved. Could 3 young people really have planned a killing in this much detail and walked away from the wreckage for nearly half a year? In late February 2003, Katie began working on a second target. Her name was Aspen Lum, the daughter of Dorothy Lum, and Katie viewed Aspen as a romantic rival. According to court records, Katie planned to strangle Aspen with a rope and then stage the scene to look like a hanging. Aspen survived. She or her parents alerted police, and the door to the investigation that had stalled for 5 months finally opened. In March 2003, Katie Bellflower and Jeffrey Hamilton were arrested. During his interrogation, Hamilton told detectives that Michael Simons had killed Jenna. The pieces of the original case finally came together. All 3 were convicted in San Joaquin County Superior Court. Michael Simons was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole plus 25 years. Catherine Bellflower was sentenced to 25 years to life. and admitted to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation on September 22, 2005. Jeffrey Hamilton was sentenced to 15 years to life and admitted to CDCR on December 2, 2005. CDCR records list Catherine Bellflower, inmate number X14096, at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Inmate records indicate she has incurred prison rule infractions during her time inside. She is eligible for parole consideration under California law, though the California Board of Parole Hearings maintains the public hearing schedule and decisions. What made Katie's case particularly striking to those who covered it was the recorded police interview. During her videotaped questioning, while in shackles, Katie complimented detectives on their clothing. At one point, she said her mother would love the shirt and tie one of them was wearing. She oscillated between teenage casualness and detailed admissions of the killing plan. East Bay Express described her appearance during the recording as resembling one of Modigliani's portraits. Dorothy Lum, the mother of Aspen, would later describe how unprepared she had been for what her daughter's friend had been planning beneath the surface. The woman she had first known as overbearing but bright had been something else entirely. While one California courtroom sent a 17-year-old to a women's facility for what could become the rest of her life, the next case is one the research dossier itself flags as not belonging in a teen killer's list at all. But because she was asked for, here is the truth of what happened in Washington Parish, Louisiana, in January 1995. Shonda Crane. The next case is Shonda Crane, and before we go any further, the public record is clear about one thing. Shonda Crane was 29 years old at the time of her crime in January 1995. She was not a teenager. She was a married mother of 3. Her story belongs in any conversation about family killings tied to debt and addiction, but not in a list of teenagers. So with that on the record, what actually happened on a dairy farm in northern Washington Parish? Shonda Spears Crane was 29 years old. She had been married to and later divorced from Yancey Brett Crane. Her father, Lander Spears Sr., and her mother, Bobby Spears, were dairy farmers in Star Hill, in the northern part of Washington Parish, Louisiana. They had built a working farm and a country grocery store nearby. Shonda was their daughter and the mother of 3 young children. On January 25, 1995, Shonda visited her parents' rural home on Highway 438. She had come to pick up one of her children. According to prosecutors, she returned inside the home and used her father's .38 caliber pistol to shoot him in the head while he slept. She then shot her mother as well. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, she drove to a country grocery store about a mile away and called 911. She told the dispatcher that she had seen blood on her mother through a window of the house. The motive, as prosecutors built it across the months that followed, was twofold. Per coverage from UPI archives in January 1997, citing prosecutor Lewis Murray III at trial, prosecutors said Shonda had lost more than $5,000 in 1994 playing video poker. They introduced evidence that she had forged checks for thousands of dollars on accounts for the dairy farm and the bar owned by her parents. Prosecutors argued she had also been motivated by a $300,000 life insurance policy on her parents. And in one of the most telling pieces of evidence, investigators told the jury that Shonda had cut the phone lines to her parents' home when she learned the bank was trying to contact them about the checks she had been writing on their accounts. Could a daughter really plan this much in advance, hour by hour, and never see herself in the act? The trial took place in Franklinton, Louisiana, in January 1997, before Judge John Green. On January 21st, 2097, a Washington Parish jury convicted Shonda Crane of first-degree murder of both of her parents. The penalty phase jury then deadlocked on the death penalty. Under Louisiana law, the deadlock meant that the death sentence could not be imposed. The default sentence was instead life imprisonment without benefit of parole, without probation, and without suspension of sentence. The lead prosecutor on the case was Lewis Murray III. Her defense was led by Thomas D'Amico. Speaking to reporters after the verdict, D'Amico said simply, "It is ridiculous to think Shonda Crane killed her parents for $50,000. Her appeals have since been exhausted." The case helped fuel a Louisiana movement against video poker. According to a published academic study by Garrett and Nichols in 2007, in the 1996 Louisiana video poker referendum, video poker was voted down in 31 parishes and retained in 33. Washington Parish, the place where Shonda's parents had been killed, was one of the 31 that voted to ban it. The Crane case had become a quiet rallying point for the movement. As of today, Shonda Crane is incarcerated at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in the St. Gabriel area outside Baton Rouge. She filed a clemency petition with Governor John Bell Edwards before his term ended in January 2024. The outcome is not publicly documented. A documentary short titled "She Is Her: The Story of Shonda Crane" was released in 2022, and an active Change.org petition continues to seek a rehearing of her case. Her supporters maintain she was framed. Civil litigation in 1999 in the case of Crane versus Crane addressed whether her 3 children would be permitted to inherit through her after she had been legally declared unworthy. Her 3 children were raised by her ex-husband. Her daughter Megan has remained close to her mother across the decades. While one Louisiana case carries on through clemency petitions decades after the killings, the final case in this list would unfold in a single house party in Scotland. Jolene Doherty. The final case is Jolene Doherty, a 17-year-old from North Lanarkshire, Scotland, who at a house party in April 2018 reached for a kitchen knife after being insulted by a young man she had met only hours earlier. By the time the sun came up, an 18-year-old was dead, and Scotland was facing the case of one of its youngest female killers. So what does it take to lose every chance at adulthood in a single moment? Jolene Doherty was 17 years old at the time of the killing. Scottish prosecutors would later describe her as one of the youngest female killers in Scottish criminal history. She had left her family home at age 15 and had a documented history of violence, including offenses involving knives. A former neighbor, speaking to the Scotsman, said of her, "She was a nice wee lassie. She was always polite to me. She was also pregnant." And on the night of April 14, 2018, the High Court would later hear she was high on cocaine and alcohol when the events unfolded. The location was a house party in Holytown, North Lanarkshire, near Motherwell. The young man Jolene encountered there was 18-year-old Connor Cowper. They had met only hours earlier that same evening. According to court records, Jolene had tried to play Connor off against another male partygoer over the course of the night. Tensions rose. At some point, Connor addressed her using a phrase the court would later quote in full. He called her, in his own words, a stupid wee girl. Witnesses described what happened next as a sudden eruption. There had been no preceding fight. There had been no scuffle on the way out the door. Jolene reached for a kitchen knife and used it on Connor's neck. The wound severed an artery. Connor Cowper died at the scene. He was 18 years old. He had known Jolene Doherty for less than half a day. Could a single word said in a single moment really have been the trigger that ended a young man's life? The investigation moved quickly. Jolene was arrested. Because of her age, she could not be named during the proceedings under Scottish law. Her trial was held at the High Court in Glasgow in 2019. The jury convicted her of murder. On January 10, 2019, at the High Court in Edinburgh, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a punishment part, the Scottish equivalent of a minimum tariff of 16 years. The sentencing judge described what she had done in stark terms. The judge called it a deliberate, brutal, unprovoked, and entirely murderous assault. She turned 18 the day she could legally be named in the press. She also gave birth in prison. Her child was the product of the pregnancy she had been carrying on the night at the house party. The Scottish Prison Service has long had policies in place for incarcerated mothers, but those policies have always existed alongside the harsher reality that a child born inside a prison would not be raised by the parent who gave birth to them in any traditional sense. Jolene's child was placed outside the prison system to be raised by relatives, separated from a mother who had not even reached her own 18th birthday at the time of the killing. Connor Cowper's family was reportedly too upset to issue a public statement. Jolene Doherty's mother declined to comment through a partner. The community of Holytown, by every available account, was simply shocked. People who had known both families were left without a way to make sense of what had happened in a house most of them had walked past hundreds of times. Jolene is currently detained in the Scottish Prison Service. Cornton Vale, which had historically served as Scotland's main women's prison, closed in April 2023. The new National Women's Facility, HMP, and Young Offenders Institution Stirling opened in July 2023. Two community custody units, named Bella in Dundee and Lilias in Glasgow, had opened in 2022. Jolene is likely housed at HMP Stirling, the country's modern women's facility designed around rehabilitation and family contact. With a 16-year minimum tariff handed down in January 2019, the earliest she can be considered for parole is January 2035. She remains in custody as of today. Her child, born inside a Scottish prison, is being raised outside its walls. Connor Cowper's grave, in a small Scottish town that had never expected to bury an 18-year-old from one of its own house parties, remains a place his family quietly visits. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.